take a step in the dark is scary. But we don't walk alone. God goes before us, beside us, and is a light unto our path. God calls us to take that first step, to put one foot in front of the other, to walk with boldness, knowing that He will illuminate every one of our steps, to trust Him and walk by faith, not by sight. He promises to be a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path, in whatever season of life, in whatever circumstance of life. So whether it's a new year, a new season, or a new day, we don't go at it alone. God goes before us. He lights each one of our steps. He fuels our faith with the same power that raised Christ from the dead, empowering us to keep putting one foot in front of the other. In the midst of darkness, remember that He knows the way. He has a plan for your today and all of your tomorrows. So today, with every step that you take, remember that He is with you. Remember that He is for you. Remember that He is constant. And remember that He is never changing. He knows exactly where you've been, and He knows exactly where you're going. So may you walk in the light of His truth. And may you always put your trust in the one who will forever be the light unto your path.
All right, so we're heading into a new year, and how many of you are doing great with your New Year's resolutions? Because we know New Year's resolutions go in one year and out the other. All right, so not going to get better than that, folks. All right, so today is a big day, right? Right? This is a huge day. Not only is it the first Sunday of the year where we're gathered together and we're going to just set some tone for the rest of the year, it's also about as close to the Super Bowl as the Bears will ever get. We're playing the Packers. And yeah, we have very little chance. And if you've ever seen the movie Dumb and Dumber, right? You know, the quote, "So you're saying there's a chance." That's how we're going into this one today, right? Okay.
As long as you know you're going to
Okay, so my name is Tim Bycroft. I am glad that you guys are with us here today. I'm the lead pastor here at the church. And if you've been around for a while, you know that we have a purpose and a meaning of why we exist and why we do the things that we do. And so would you just say that with me, that the Point Church exists to welcome the unchurched to become fully devoted followers of Jesus. We do this by pointing people to God. We do this by pointing people to Jesus Christ. And we do this by pointing people to community, which is the church, where we learn to encourage and equip one another on this journey to become fully devoted followers of Jesus. And we want to do this by demonstrating not the only characteristics of God, but three of probably the greatest characteristics that God has demonstrated to us. We want to demonstrate that to one another, and that is the characteristics of love, acceptance, and forgiveness. So we're glad that you guys are here as we jump into this new year, and I want to start a new series today. It's just around God's vision for our lives. We're going to be talking about this over the next several weeks, about what God's vision is for our life. And one of the reasons I want to do this is because I think as we're looking at the calendar years, we're looking at how God has been doing things in this church community, I'm telling you, I'm excited about 2025. I'm excited about some of the things that are coming up. I'm excited about where we're going as a church. I'm excited about what God is doing in our church to change lives, because let's just do a little brief survey. How many in here have had God change their lives? You see those hands? God is still impacting lives, still changing lives, and He's going to do even more so, I believe, in 2025. And I haven't been able to say this for a few years, probably several years, but I'm excited about 2025. Amen. I really am. And so to start this year off, I just want to talk about what is God's vision in your life? What is God's vision in the life of the church? I'm going to give you a passage of scripture that's going to kind of lead where we're going in this series. And to give you a little background on this passage before I read it, it's the Apostle Paul. Now, the Apostle Paul, he's had his life changed radically by God, and he's kind of giving his religious testimony. As a matter of fact, it's in a courtroom setting, so it's almost like a courtroom testimony about his life. And if you know anything about the Apostle Paul, he had his life transformed by Jesus, like most of us in this room have had. His was pretty dramatic. I mean, he goes from like a terrorist, okay? I mean, he really was a religious terrorist who was out murdering Christians. And then by the transformation of Jesus Christ, he becomes one of the leading missionaries to the world. That's pretty incredible. And he details this vision that Jesus has given to him. He shares this vision with the king. Paul wraps up his testimony in Acts chapter 26, verse 19, and he says this: "What could I do, King Agrippa? I couldn't just walk away from the vision like that. I became an obedient believer on the spot." And I love that. I love what he says. I couldn't help but follow the vision that God has given me. And how many of us as Christians want to say the same thing? That because of what Jesus Christ has done in our lives, we want to be obedient to what God's vision is in our lives. Would you agree with me? I want to fulfill the vision that God gave me in my life, and I'm sure that you want to fulfill the vision that God has given you in your life. But what becomes the obvious question in that is, how do I know my vision? How do I know what God has given me? And I don't think you can actually fulfill your vision, and this is kind of an obvious statement, unless you see it, unless you know it, unless you understand it. And so we're going to be unpacking that. What does it look like to, number one, see, know, and understand God's vision for our lives, number one, individually, but also as a church? Seeing with faith. Number one, and this is what we're going to talk about today, is I think we have to see with faith. And the opposite of that is seeing with fear. And nobody wants to admit, it takes some soul searching on my part at least, to admit that sometimes I see with fear instead of faith. Right? And we need to do the opposite. And so I'm going to go to an Old Testament story, Old Testament passage. It's a true story. It's found in Numbers chapter 13 and chapter 14. And just to give you a little context of what is happening here, is that God had promised the Israelite nation that he would send them to the promised land. You see, for 400 years, okay, just stop and think about that. 400 years. Let that sink in. For 400 years, the Israelite nation, the Jewish people, have been slaves to the Egyptians. 400 years. That's a long time. And God had said, I'm going to take you out of this. I'm going to take you out of this slavery, and I'm going to take you to the promised land. The promised land represented their future. It represented their inheritance. It represented what God wanted them to enjoy in life. And literally, this becomes what we know as the land of Israel. The now enslaved Israelites are freed from the Egyptians. And you may remember the story, right? You may remember the story that the reason that the Egyptians Pharaoh finally gave up his control over them were the plagues. You might remember the Passover that took place at that time. But anyway, God got their attention. God got the Egyptians' attention, and finally he lets the Israelites go. And they escape into the desert. You may remember the Red Sea experience. They're wandering around in the desert, and God gives them vision and direction while they are out there. They're eating manna. They're eating quail. They're crossing the desert. And for 40 years, they're kind of wandering around the desert following God's direction. And they finally come to the place where they see the promised land. Now, stop and consider this for just a second. God had made a promise that he was going to take them out of slavery and bring them to the promised land. How long did they wander in the desert? 40 years. God is patient. Some of you guys have prayed to God for release from something in your life. You prayed it last week, and now you're wondering if God even exists. And, it's a week later, but I will tell you that God always comes through on his promises. He always answers our prayers. He may not necessarily answer them the way we think he's going to answer them, but he always answers prayer. But our God is patient. So finally, they come to the edge of the promised land, and Moses chooses 12 representatives. And these 12 representatives are going to go into this promised land, this land of Canaan, and check it out. They're going to, basically do some spy work in the land of Canaan. And Moses says, I want you to go, I want you to check it out, I want you to see what is there, and I want you to return with a report. And this is kind of a fact-finding mission, if you will, but I would label it also as a vision trip. They're going to go in and try to get some vision of what they're getting ready to go into. And that's where we pick this up in Numbers chapter 13. It says this. Now Moses gave the men these instructions as he sent them out to explore the new land. Go northward towards the Negev, into the hill country, and see what the land is like, and find out whether the people living there are strong or weak. Are they few? Are they many? What kind of land do they live in? Is it good? Is it bad? Do the towns have walls? Are they protected? How's the soil? Is it fertile or is it poor? Are there trees? What kind of people are they? Do they own cats? Are they Packer fans? Enter the land boldly and bring samples of the crops that you see. And so, why did Moses do this? Why did Moses send these 12 guys into the land of Canaan to spy, to do this vision trip? I think it can be said this way. Before people can succeed in a goal, they have to know the goal, right? Before you can ever succeed in a goal, you have to know what the goal is. And it's very simple, right? And so Moses is sending them out. He's sending them into this land to check it out, to spy it out, to see what is our goal. Everything that's ever been accomplished in history, I would say this. Just consider this for just a second. Everything that's ever been accomplished in history started with an idea in somebody's mind. They had to see it. They had to imagine it. They had to know, with eyes to see and ears to hear, they had to know what the goal is. Verse 21. So they sent spies, and they spied out all the lands, all the way from the wilderness up from Hebron, and there they saw the Ammonites, the Shishites. I knew I was going to screw up on that one. I said it right. And the Talmonites, all the families descended from Anak. I love the Old Testament. Some of those words. Sometimes you just want to go, Pat, I need to buy a vowel for that word because this doesn't make sense. All right. So why were these tribes mentioned? I was just going to try to take that part out so I didn't have to say the names, but why were these tribes mentioned? It's actually important because archaeological evidence and historical evidence shows that these tribes right here is a race of giants. They're giants. They're fearsome warriors. Oh, the land was filled with giants. Great. No problem. We got this. So when they came to Eshcol, they cut down a cluster of grapes so large that it took 2 of them to carry it back on a pole. Those are big grapes. I mean, it took 2 guys with a pole to carry the grapes. Think Fruit of the Loom. You remember the Fruit of the Loom commercials back in the day? With the guys, some of you are just like, no. That's what I imagine going on this pole, all right? And they brought back samples of pomegranates because apparently they needed to make body soap, and figs. Isn't that the only reason pomegranates are around? For body soap? It is. All right, so Numbers 13:25. After seeing this, after seeing what they had in this vision trip, after seeing the land for 40 days, the men returned to Moses and Aaron and the people of Israel, and they reported to the whole community what they had seen, and they showed him the fruit that they had taken from the land. Now this sounds really promising. If you stop and you're able to see the fruit that they're bringing back. It's huge. It's amazing. It's great. Obviously, this land has promise, but it also has problems. And it has to do, and I'm going to say this, the problem had to do more with vision than it did what was actually in Canaan. And I'll get to that here in a minute. That's why we're sharing this story, because there was 12 spies, right? 12 spies went out. 2 of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, they look at their future with faith. They look at the promised land. God has promised this land to them, and they're just like, this is awesome. You should see it. And then 10 of them were like, whoa. They're looking at their future with fear. There's just no way. And it reminds me of a song we used to sing when I went to church. 12 men went to spy on Canaan. 10 were bad and 2 were good. What did they see when they spied on Canaan? 10 were bad and 2 were good. Some saw giants big and tall. Some saw grapes in clusters fall. Some saw God was over all. 10 were bad and 2 were good. Anyway, that's the story. And that's why I'm not invited to sing on the worship team. But this story illustrates some traps that we can fall into. And I want to just walk down through this story because there's traps where we can fall into fear more than faith in our lives when we're looking at the future. And when you're looking at the future with fear instead of faith, number one, I believe this, and we can see this through the tribe of Israel, that I can easily overemphasize the negatives in my life. Right? We can easily overemphasize all the negative things that are taking place in our lives. Verse 27 says this. This was their report to Moses. We arrived in the land you sent us to see. And it is indeed a magnificent country. It's a land flowing with milk and honey. Oh, here's some of the fruit as proof, right? These ginormous fruit that they brought back. But, last week we talked about the but being a great thing. This time the but's not such a great thing. It's conflicting information. But the people living there are powerful, and their cities and their towns are fortified, and they're very large. And we also saw the Anakim, the descendants of Anak, who lived in the desert. Not all positive news, right? Not all positive news. But here's the thing. They had a choice. What are you going to focus on? What are you going to emphasize? In your vision, in your plans, what God is sending you to, what are you going to focus on? And as you read on, what you're going to see is the majority of people focused in on the negative, on the fear. Some of the spies brought back conflicting news. Two of the spies, right, they came back with eyes full of faith. If God has sent us there, this is amazing. You should see it. 10 of them came back and said, yeah, we're not sure. If God sent us there, I don't know how he's going to handle this. Okay? And they delivered more negative news than positive news. And by the way, I think the ratio in news, even today, is still true. Wouldn't you agree? Like 1 out of every, who knows, 5, 6, 7 news reports is negative, where 1 might be positive. And the negative news stories usually travel faster. As a matter of fact, we know this. Negative news spreads faster. About 10 times on social media, negative news travels 10 times faster than positive news. We know this. And so we can easily focus in on the negatives instead of the positives when we're looking through the eyes of fear instead of faith. Number 2, I can pay too much attention to what other people are doing. When we're focused on fear instead of faith, I can easily watch what other people are doing and fall into the same trap that they are. Pay too much attention to what they're doing. In verse 29, it says this. They were not focusing on the beauty and the value of the land. It says the Amalekites live in the Negev, and the Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites live in the hill country, and the Canaanites live near the sea along the Jordan River there. And what they were saying is, yeah, we went in there, but what's the point? What's the point of going there? It's already taken. All the land is taken. All the good land is taken up. Why would we even want to try to go over there? There wouldn't be enough for us. All the good is already taken by other tribes. There's no room in this promised land for more people, especially this many people. There isn't enough resources for everybody. There's not enough, there's already enough people trying to take all the resources that are there. Ultimately, what they are saying is, God, why did you bring us here? Because there's not enough. I think this. If you look through the eyes of fear, here's what can happen so easily, at least in my life. I can develop a mentality of scarcity. Like this scarcity mentality which creates stress in your life because you never think there's enough. You never think that God has provided enough. You never think that there's enough for you. You look at other people and you go, look what they have, but I don't have. And all of a sudden you start having this scarcity mindset. All the good experiences are gone. All the good jobs are gone. All the good homes are gone. All the good husbands are married, which might be true. Are you looking around with a scarcity mindset? When you know that God has led you with a vision, when you know that God has given you a purpose in life and meaning in life, when God has given you a direction in life, you've got to look at that with the eyes of faith and not fear. The third trap. When I look at the future with fear instead of faith, I underestimate the abilities that God has given me. I underestimate the abilities that God has given me. Fear can drive you to think that God's provision is just never enough. Numbers 13:31. But the men who had gone with Caleb said, we can't attack those people. They're stronger than we are. We can't do this. They underestimated not only their abilities, but the abilities that God was working in them and through them. Did you know that people who always say, hear me on this. Did you know that people who always say, I can't, and the people who say, I can, are both correct? Because fear creates self-fulfilling prophecies in your life. When you say, I can't, the battle's already lost. When you say, I can't, you're creating a self-fulfilling prophecy in your life where you've already given up before you even started. I can't is a self-fulfilling prophecy. We many times we waste our talents, we miss opportunities. You set yourself up by being self-defeating with those types of predictions. And what you're setting yourself up with is simply this. It's all about attitude. Is your attitude, I can't, we can't, there's no way this is possible? Or if God has given you a vision and direction, Do you have the faith to go, but he can, no matter what? No matter what my limitations are, God can. I'm inadequate, I'm incapable. And to some degree, hear me on this, you are right. But with God, all things are possible. Amen. With God, all things are possible. The spies with the fear-based vision saw themselves as inadequate, unable to do the task that God has called them to do. In verse 32, it says, the land that we traveled through and explored will devour anyone who goes to live there. All the people we saw there were huge. We even saw giants there, the descendants of Anak. Next to them, we felt like grasshoppers. And that's what they thought too. Okay? The Hebrew word for giant, this is kind of cool. Some of you may have studied this or whatever, but the Hebrew word for giant here is Nephilim, which is kind of an interesting historical thing that took place where actually angels came down and had sex with humans. And they created giant human beings. Okay? That's the Nephilim. So it was like, whoa, these guys are huge. By the way, if we're going to study Hebrew, the Hebrew word for handsome is Pastor Tim. You can look it up. You see what they were saying here? We're so small, we're like insects compared to these guys. They're going to squish us like bugs, okay? They're going to eat our lunch. They're giants, they're bullies, they're tyrants. I mean, these guys hunt grizzly bears with rubber bands. They're huge. And we have no way of going against these guys. There's just no possible way. And what they're doing is they're projecting their fears on others. That's one of the problems with fear-based vision, is that it's easy to project your fears onto someone else. If you think you look a certain way, you think everyone else thinks you look a certain way, and that's a problem, that's a trap, which leads me to number 4 is this. I can easily infect others with my negativity. I can affect other people with my negativity. Did you know that fear is contagious? Oh, yeah. I mean, fear is contagious. You, as a parent, you can project your fears onto your children, and that can become a generational issue. It just can. Verse 32, they spread the bad report about the land that they explored. They just didn't keep it to themselves. What fear that they had inside of them, they just shared with everybody else. And this is what happens when you become afraid, when you're driven by fear, right? You can start talking trash. You can start talking negativity. You can start complaining. You start griping. You start building your ally base because you want other people to agree with you. And so you start building your ally base with all this negativity and fear. This is why the Bible tells us, this is going to be maybe the best thing I'm going to share with you guys today. If you miss anything else, grasp this. The Bible tells us not to hang out with negative people. Did you know that? Did you know that there's Proverbs over and over and over and over in the Proverbs? It says, stop hanging out with scoffers, stop hanging out with cynics, stop hanging out with negative people and critics and complainers. I mean, over and over and over in the Proverbs, it says that. Why? Because that type of attitude is very contagious. Just stop it. Don't go there. One of the things I noticed, and you know, we're getting close to 5 years removed. How many of you noticed in 2020 that there was a lot of conspiracy theories? Well, yeah, just 2020, because I'm telling you, in 2020, there was probably more conspiracy theories that took place then than probably the previous 10 years, decades, maybe. There was so much going around. And why was that? Because negative news travels fast. Fear breeds fear. And people were listening to a lot of fear-mongering that was taking place during 2020. I'm not taking away from the fact that COVID was a real thing and happened. And many people were hurt from it. Some people died from it. I'm not taking away from that. But I will tell you that the fear that was driven by this pandemic was insane. And it was based a lot on conspiracies. And we know that now, 4 years removed. But if you're hearing conspiracies, I want you to think about this just a second. When Isaiah, he just says it this way. Isaiah, he says, don't say that everything that people call a conspiracy is a conspiracy, and don't fear what they fear. Don't let it terrify you. In other words, don't let somebody else's fear drive you to become fearful. Especially if you have faith. If you're driven by faith, that drives away fear. Fear is always driven away by faith. God says, don't fear what they fear. Don't be terrified by what they're terrified about. Have faith in me. Fifth trap. If you're always driven by fear versus faith, I will tell you this. You can really make yourself miserable. When I look at my life, and there's been times, and there's still times that I look to the future with fear, I can make myself miserable. You know where most of my sleepless nights come from? The spiraling of what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen, what's going to happen. I'm afraid what's going to happen. Faith allows you to sleep like a baby because you know God's still in control. Here's what happened. After the 10 spies came back, their fear-based report, in Numbers chapter 14, it says this, the whole community began weeping out loud, and they cried all night. Their voices rose in a great chorus to protest against Moses and Aaron. If we'd only just died in Egypt, or even out in the wilderness, they complained. I mean, are you kidding me? What a bunch of pity party poo-poo heads. This is crazy. We would have, think about this. We would have rather stayed as slaves to the Egyptians than face what God is calling us to face. That's what they're saying. I'd rather have stayed as a slave in the land of Egypt than to go through what God is calling me to go through. I would have rather died in the desert than face the future because I'm so afraid. Let's just choose a new leader and go back to Egypt. This is a very important verse because I think it's got some warning signs in it. I'm going to hang out here for just a minute because I think these warning signs are something that we can all look at our lives and go, hey, if anything like this is starting to rear its ugly head, it might just be a sign that we're falling more into fear than we are to faith. And the first thing you see in here is your sadness in life increases. It says they cried all night. And I'm going to just say this. That's depression. Depression can be caused, listen, I know, depression can be caused by a myriad of things, a lot of different things. But sometimes it's simply caused by fear. Number two, your complaining increases. It says they grumbled and they complained. Why? Because they were afraid. Number three, they were second guessing their leaders. They grumbled and they complained. A great chorus of people started complaining about Moses and Aaron. They said, we wish you wouldn't have led us here. You're doing a lousy job of leading. Let us choose another leader so that we can go back to Egypt. And I'm going to guess that nobody in here, because, you're good, solid, faithful Christians, never complain about your leaders. That was really quiet. Too quiet. And number four, you want to go backwards. You want to go back to the good old days. You want to go back to a prior time where you weren't having to step out in faith. You want to go back to a place where it might not be so scary or fearful to take that next step that God is calling you to do. And so let's just go back to our comfort zone and stay there where it's nice and comfortable. But I will tell you guys, God never intended for the church to be comfortable. He intended it to be moving forward into the future, taking ground day by day. Amen. Those are signs that maybe you're living by faith, a vision of fear and not of faith. So, let me wrap up with this. Oh. What's the antidote? Well, that's what we're going to look at over the next several weeks, okay? The antidote to living with fear versus living with faith. We want to look at the antidote over the next several weeks, but if I could just narrow it down to one sentence, it would be something like this. You need to develop a life of vision, of faith in God and the power and the direction of His Holy Spirit. That's it. You need to develop a life vision of faith in God, empowered by the Holy Spirit. Now, there's two guys who come back with a minority report. These two guys are Caleb and Joshua. And eventually, these two guys actually make it into the promised land, which is awesome. Here's what Caleb said in faith. In Numbers chapter 13, verse 30, Caleb silenced the people before Moses. And he said, we should go at once. We should go at once. We should take possession of the land right now. We can certainly do this. Where did that come from? That came from faith over fear. He said, let's do this. Let's stop defeating ourselves. The paralysis of analysis is keeping us where we are right now instead of just moving forward where God has called us to go. You defeat your... Here's a little thing. Here's a little thing about fear. Can I tell you something? That you defeat fear not by arguing against fear, but you defeat fear with movement against it. Not by discussing it, not by focusing on it, but by doing the opposite of what your fear is telling you to do. Doing the thing that you fear the most. That's what Caleb is saying right here. He says, let's move forward. Let's take the ground that God has promised us. Let's go where God is calling us to. God has set a vision before us. Stop allowing fear to move where God is telling us to move, and let's move forward. Because the longer that we stay in this spot, trying to make an analysis of our fear, whether it's actual or not, or what we should do, or this, that, and the other, fear is defeating us. Move forward. Here's what Joshua said. Then Joshua said, we saw the Lord ourselves. It was very good. The land ourselves, and it was very good. If we obey the Lord, He will surely give us the land rich with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people of the land. They are only helpless prey to us. They have no protection. Why? Because the Lord is with us. So don't be afraid of them. See, here's what I think. Going into 2025, there's a lot of things that you may face. There are going to be relational problems, maybe health problems, financial problems. There's going to be things that come up at your job or things that happen in your family. And it's so easy for us to get caught up in the fear instead of using our faith. But I will tell you this, remember this, hold on to this. You plus God is everything. You plus God is always the majority. You plus God, if something is against you, man, it's just going to fall. They have no protection. Don't be afraid of them. Because if God is for us, who can be against us? Sadly, unfortunately, the difference between faith and fear is a choice. We get to choose it. And the majority, many times, as in our story, will revert back to fear. And here's the scary thing about that. Scriptures are very clear that the 10, plus a lot of the other scoffers who were driven by fear when they got to the promised land, never got to see the promised land. Caleb and Joshua did. It's one of the saddest verses in the Bible. It's found in Hebrews chapter 3. It says, so we see that they, the people who were slaves that had been freed, they were not able to enter the promised land because of their unbelief. Faith simply comes with believing that God will do what he's promised to do. You need to see what God's got in store for you. You need to know what God's got in store for you. You need to understand what God's got in store for you. And there's going to be obstacles come up. There's going to be things that just want to distract you from that. And my challenge for us as believers here today is this. As we go into 2025, is that if God is for you, who can be against you? To live your life based upon faith in him and not fear of the things of this world. God has called us to something bigger and grander in our lives. Don't let fear keep you. Don't let fear keep you from doing what God has called you to do, because I guarantee you this, God has big things in store for you in your life. So God, I pray today that each of us would seek out the direction that you're calling us to be able to see and to know and to understand the vision that you have for our lives, the purpose that you have, the meaning that you have for our lives. God, because it's probably so much grander than anything that we can come up with on our own anyway. And God, when fear starts to creep in and we start to get distracted by the voices in our own head or the voices of other people, God, I pray that your Holy Spirit would guide and direct and protect our minds so that we could continue to believe in you and have faith in you and trust in you to do the things that you've called us to be the people you've called us to be. Maybe today, God, as we start into 2025, maybe today is the day to just say, you know what, I'm recommitting myself. I'm recommitting myself to following your lead. Even into the places it just looks scary, and there's giants, and there's things I don't necessarily want to do, but God, this is where you're calling. And so I go with faith. I go with faith. Trusting that you'll be everything that we need. Because we know, God, that if you are for us, who or what could ever be against us?